Gain-of-function research seeks to make a virus more easily transmissible between humans, to increase the severity of the disease it triggers, or to make it resistant to existing treatments or vaccines.
There are obviously valid reasons for gain-of-function research, and the main reason is to understand pathogens better, to understand the way they transmit and behave, and thereby to make vaccines, drugs, etc.
So how many vaccines have been developed as a result of gain-of-function research?
None. There have been no preemptive vaccines to date.
Have any pandemics been prevented thanks to gain-of-function research?
The answer is not that I know of.
Not that I'm aware.
What's clear is that it didn't prevent this coronavirus pandemic.
Actually, none of the gain-of-function research that was done over the past decades or whatever, none of it contributed to finding a vaccine or cure for SARS-CoV-2, for COVID-19.
Why does it matter? Because gain-of-function research with laboratory-created viruses not found in nature could cause a pandemic even worse the next time. We're suffering today from one that has a mortality of approximately 1%. They're experimenting with viruses that have mortalities of between 15 and 50%. Yes, our civilization could be at risk from one of these viruses. Experiments that combine unknown viruses with known pandemic-causing viruses are incredibly risky. Experiments that combine unknown viruses with coronaviruses that have as much as 50% mortality could endanger civilization as we know it. You continue to support NIH money going to Wuhan. You continue to say you trust the Chinese scientist. You appear to have learned nothing from this pandemic. Will you today finally take some responsibility for funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Senator, with all due respect, I disagree with so many of the things that you've said. First of all, gain of function is a very nebulous term. We have spent, not us, but outside bodies, a considerable amount of effort to give a more precise definition to the type of research that is of concern that might lead to a dangerous situation. You are aware of that. That is called P3CO.
We're aware that you deleted gain of function from the NIH website.
Well, I can get back to that in a moment if we have time, but let's get back to the operating framework and guide rails of which we operate under. And you have ignored them. The guidelines are very, very clear that you have to be dealing with a pathogen that clearly is shown and very likely to be highly transmissible in an uncontrollable way in humans and to have a high degree of morbidity and mortality, and that you do experiments to enhance that, hence the word EPPP, enhanced pathogens of
So when EcoHealth Alliance took the virus, SHC014, and combined it with WIV1 and caused a recombinant virus that doesn't exist in nature, and it made mice sicker, mice that had humanized cells, you're saying that that's not gain-of-function research?
According to the framework and guidelines.
So what you're doing is defining away gain-of-function. No. You're simply saying it doesn't exist because you changed the definition on the NIH website. This is terrible, and you're completely trying to escape the idea that we should do something about trying to prevent a pandemic from leaking from a lab. The preponderance of evidence now points towards this coming from the lab, and what you've done is change the definition on your website to try to cover your ass, basically. That's what you've done. You've changed the website to try to have a new definition that doesn't include the risky research that's going on. Until you admit that it's risky, we're not going to get anywhere. You have to admit that this research was risky. The NIH has now rebuked them. Your own agency has rebuked them. But the thing is you're still unwilling to admit that they gained in function when they say they became sicker. They gained in lethality. It's a new virus. That's not gain of function?
According to the definition that is currently operable.
So let's look a bit more closely at how gain-of-function research is done. One method is to genetically re-engineer pathogens by inserting genes from one virus into another to make it more aggressive.
Another, simpler method is called animal passaging. Researchers inject a virus into ferrets or so-called humanized mice. These mice have been genetically manipulated to have human lung receptors. The virus undergoes slight mutations as it passes through several generations of mice. The scientists select the strongest mutations until the virus eventually becomes transmissible to humans.
The scientific technology today is so good that you can make a whole genome of a virus with no scars, no seams or anything. It looks perfectly natural.
2 years ago this month, Dr. Fauci has put on notice that the virus most likely came from a lab that was doing gain-of-function research. He gets a letter on January 31st, 10:32 p.m. 2020. He gets an email, from Dr. Christian Anderson that says, the virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. Dr. Fauci goes into complete overdrive to cover this information up and not present it to the American people. He organizes a conference call the next day with Fauci, Collins, and 11 virologists from around the world on that call. Dr. Gary on that call says this, I don't know how this happens in nature, but it would be easy to do in a lab. 4 days later, those people who express those sentiments start to change their position. They write a piece in Nature Medicine magazine on February 16th. It first gets published online. That piece is then cited on February 9th, 2020 in the now famous letter in The Lancet that becomes the gospel that this thing, according to Fauci and this group, didn't come from a lab. All that happens in 20 days. So they go from this thing looks engineered, this thing is not consistent with evolutionary theory, this thing could not have happened in nature, this thing would be easy to do in a lab, to completely changing their position. And here's the kicker. The two guys who said those things, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, 3 months later get rewarded with an $8.9 million grant from Dr. Fauci to continue to do research on coronavirus. Why don't they want to know how the virus started that has disrupted our lives for now almost a full 2 years?
In 2011, an extreme gain-of-function experiment rocked the science world. Scientists used the serial passaging method to make the H5N1 avian flu virus more transmissible to humans. The lead scientist, Ron Fouchier, claimed he created one of the most dangerous viruses you can make.
They had taken a virus that was deadly but not good at infecting humans and made it also very infectious. So that kind of research, I think, is the risks are immensely high. If it broke out, there would be just widespread death. But the benefits, what are they? Many scientists look at this experiment and they think, why? Why did you do this?
So the topic of this morning's session is the publication of research involving the H1N1 avian influenza. And representing the U.S. government and the funding agency for this research is Dr. Tony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So the recommendations that the NSABB came back with was that these papers would in fact not be published in full. We recommended to the U.S. government that the papers be modified, the results and experimental details be redacted so that somebody with malevolent intent could not exactly replicate the results.
That is not what happens. When a ferret sneezes on another ferret, the ferret gets infected, gets flu-like syndrome, doesn't get sick, recovers, and does not die. And I think when you talk about forgetting about any of the process, just the perception that's out there. Am I correct, Ron?
Absolutely, Tony. These viruses do not kill ferrets if they are sneezed upon. And the second point I was trying to make is that it is even unlikely that if this virus would be released out in a ferret colony, it would spread like wildfire in ferrets. And so to then extrapolate that this virus would spread like wildfire in humans is really, really far-fetched at this stage. You know, if anything, our data suggests that this virus spreads poorly. It is aerosol transmitted and therefore scientifically very, very interesting to study. But whether this virus would, if it would ever escape from a lab, would start spreading, we don't know.
I'm sure we had discussions, but it never reached the point where we were making recommendations for strain destruction. So we didn't deal with that issue.
So the NSAB process really has to do with dual use, but maybe that's the wrong approach. It should be really have to do with the risk issue, which is more immediate, having to do with the risks of the organism either escaping or being transported out of the lab.
Let me answer the first question. I'll let you answer the second one on risk-benefit analysis. So something that needs to be clearly explained is the NSABB is an advisory board, and we only do what we're asked to do by the U.S. government. So the reason we didn't review these projects when they were first being funded is because we weren't asked.
I'm not sure if this task should really be taken over by a board of 20, 23 experts or so. I think this should be really left to the entire community to discuss, because we are discussing points here. We're discussing mutants nobody knows about. It's a little bit weird to me. So just as a general remark.
For sure, nuclear war and climate change are indeed existential threats to humanity. Yet there are other developments in technology that portend a dangerous global instability. Cyber-enabled information warfare strikes at the very heart of what makes human interaction possible: information and trust. Add to that artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, biological threats, and the movement of conflict to outer space, and we have a witch's brew of ingredients for global conflict. Dangerous regimes continue to work on potential pathogens.
This is no mere analogy. We are now 100 seconds to midnight, and the world needs to wake up.